So the year 2100. So everybody has its crystal ball, so we are going to talk about that. So what kind of world will you be living in? And realizing that prosperous future will require immediate collective action, how do we need to live in terms of business? So to start, I would like to give you a few facts and figures. So today, we need to reduce our CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 in order to meet the objective of the Paris Agreement. But today, when you look at the energy mix, it's 80% coming from fossil fuel. We all know that the population will grow. We all know that there may be a scenario in which the climate will be, temperature may be increased by 4 degrees, and even 6 degrees in the region. Everything will have very negative consequences like food security, typhoon, flood, heat, extreme temperature, etc., etc. Having said that, we still see a bit of positive facts, and I hope we can give some today. We have seen some investors disinvesting from fossil fuel. 11 billion of USD have been disinvested from investors from the fossil fuel industry. We see a lot of population fighting, being in the streets, pushing government for more action on climate issues. We have seen also, of course, politics and central banks being very active, and of course, financial players. So I would like to raise this question in 2100. Will it be a prosperous future or world in ruins? So we are going to debate today on this very topic, and I will start with the first question to my panelists. So the first question is more related to the world in terms of population. You know that the world may reach 11 billion by 2100. So can we manage all social and economic issues with the climate issues as well? How can everyone help in shifting the model to a three-dimension approach? And when we say three-dimension, it's economic, social, and environmental matters. Who could be the stakeholders? Please, who want to start first? Women first, or I leave the floor to Daniel. Start.
Happy to start. So I think if you think about the world in 2100 with 11 billion people, we know we need to make the right investments today. And if you go by just the facts, we're failing at the moment. We know we need to invest about 6 to 8 trillion every year to achieve the Paris Agreement and implement the Sustainable Development Goals. At the best, at the moment, we invest 1 trillion. So we have a very, very sizable gap between the investment that is needed every year and the investment that we're making. It gets even worse. If you think about where the investment is needed, about 2/3 of investments need to happen in emerging markets. And we know that at the moment, less than 25% are actually happening in emerging markets. So we have a big funding mismatch between where money is going and where it needs to be going, and we're not investing enough. And that obviously is a multiplying effect that we will see play through. But also, I think there is some hope. If you look at the absolute numbers, we know we need to invest about 100 trillion over the next 20 years. And if you think about how much money has signed up at the moment under the principles of responsible investing, it's 90 trillion. So you look at this and you say, actually, there seems to be the willingness to actually combat these changes, these challenges. And if you ask investors, 94% of investors in the world will tell you that they are actually very committed to make sustainable finance a priority. They tell you that sustainable finance is either important or very important. So there is some hope, and then you ask yourself the question, why isn't it happening any faster? And I think you always come to 4 big topics. One topic and one challenge is we don't have enough information. Many investors will tell you, I don't have enough data and disclosure to actually direct my funds in the right direction. The second topic is the inconsistency of definition. Every one of us is using different definitions when it comes to sustainability. The third one is most people in the industry will admit that we actually don't have enough knowledge. And then the last one, I think that's the biggest one, is we have a major mismatch at the moment between what money wants to invest in, which is liquid assets in US dollars without political risk, and most of the investments sitting in emerging markets, 20-year projects with significant political risk. And so I think you are right to say what needs to happen. I don't think there's a single stakeholder that can make the change. You need the whole group of stakeholders come together between regulators that are becoming more and more active, governments that are setting the right incentives and disincentives, and the financial services industry and the real economy, and actually playing that game, and we can explore it a bit more as we go along. But I think your question is right. If we want to tackle the 2100 challenge, it feels like the next race to the moon, and we need to start that race to the moon now.
Thank you, Daniel.
I would echo a huge amount of what Daniel said. Just a few things to add. I'm an optimist, so I'm going to vote for a prosperous future. I think one of the things that makes me confident in that is I think we've tended to see social, economic, environmental concerns as somewhat separate and independent of one another. And I think what we're seeing is an increasing convergence between those things. So obviously at BlackRock we focus a lot on investment risk and wanting to ensure that we advise clients with a risk-oriented mindset. And what's increasingly apparent, and I've definitely seen this accelerate the last couple of years, is that climate risk is becoming seen as just that, a risk to the portfolio. Even if you take out concerns that this is the right thing to do when climate change is happening, for companies to not think about the risk that carbon in their portfolio represents is for them to mismanage that portfolio. So for example, if you are a company and you're issuing bonds and you have a very high level of carbon risk in your business and in your company, there are significant groups of investors around the world, initially European but now becoming a global phenomenon, that simply won't buy your bonds because they view carbon as a risk. And that has very significant economic implications for that company. And so I think what that's an example of is the convergence between environmental risk and economic risk. And I think as those things come together, we will start to see money move in a more meaningful fashion, more like the numbers that you describe in the trillions. I think the challenge is it simply needs to happen more quickly. I think the direction of travel is right, but when we think about the scale of the challenge that we face, the question is, will we move quickly enough? And again, to echo Daniel's point, I think that we can't have individual stakeholders looking to each other to make the change. This is about an ecosystem change, and I think that we need stakeholders to come together, which is obviously challenging, not just across their own boundaries in terms of responsibility, but across geography, to actually come together to find a solution. And I don't think they're going to have a choice. I think that, for companies, as we think about the millennials becoming the largest group of employees across the world, this matters to them. It matters obviously to many non-millennials as well, but this matters, and a company's ability to attract talent and be successful will be directly impacted by these issues, and a company's ability to raise funding will be directly impacted by these issues. And I think the good news in that is that this will make this a mainstream economic concern, rather than viewing these forces as independent of one another, which I think if we continue to do that and all point at each other, we're not going to get the kind of ecosystem solution that we need to see with stakeholders coming together.
Thank you, Jeremy. Michael?
All right. I'm also going to take a positive stance on this. Most of us here have been involved in the sustainability arena for at least 5 or 6 years. And 5 years ago, the regulators, the real economy, the financial service industry, and to be fair, large amounts of the population were not engaged. And I think between those three, which Daniel eloquently brought up, and also the fourth, which you brought up as well, which is not just the millennials, but just the general population, have been left behind in the discussion. Arguably, this is going to affect not only their investment portfolios, but making sustainable investments has things to do with your health. And in the UK, we saw $5 billion of costs related to diseases around air quality. And you see that in every Asian country, as well as in South Africa, all over the world, United States. So I think it's going to be very important. But I guess the key element is looking at those four stakeholders. 5 years ago, you didn't have the TCFD. You didn't have the NGFS. For those of you that don't know what that is, the TCFD is basically how do you showed what a carbon footprint is. How do you give the data out on that? And that came out of the G20 and the FSB, and that's moving very quickly through the global real economy. When that starts manifesting itself, as Daniel pointed out, you'll start seeing data. The second area is around the NGFS. Who would have thought, even a year ago, you would have almost 50 central banks looking at where climate threatens financial stability? Actually would not have been heard of 5 years ago. So on the regulatory side, it's going well. On the policy side, you're seeing governments decide that their countries are going to be carbon neutral by 2040 or 50. This will have huge effects on real stocks and real economies. If you can't sell your automobile to a country because it's an internal combustion machine, that's going to have a real effect. So the engagement part of people like HSBC and BlackRock are absolutely going to be essential in helping steer their clients and their customers into the right area. So those are absolutely essential. We're seeing those go. And then I think the real part that's been lost has been the populations. I think if we can start making this the single most focused movement globally, you'll see from the bottom up support on these. So in terms of path of travel and acceleration, I see that. There's huge obstacles. They're absolutely devastating. But I think if we start focusing on these four groups of stakeholders, treating them seriously, engaging with them, we've actually got a shot. We have the same level of acceleration in the next 5 years, or more than we've had in the first 5 years, last 5 years. There is hope.
Thank you, Michael. So maybe just for the benefit of the audience, so TCFD is a task force for climate disclosure. And you also mentioned the NGFS, so the green, it's to green the financial institutions, so it's handled by the central banks, having a working group on green topics. Thank you, Michael. Thomas?
Thank you, Dominique. Yeah, first I'd like to point out that the insight that climate and other ESG factors have a significant financial value has come honestly late, but that has evolved actually quite fast. And of course the stakes also are high, especially when we speak about climate change. First of all, we may end up in a world where part of the world is not insurable anymore. We have assets, investments in assets that may lose their value due to carbon intensity being part of the problem, and also actually litigation risk of those companies that are perceived to be part of the problem and not the solution. But I also like to point out that this is not only about this, there are tremendous business opportunities in all this as well. Of course, for those actors that are able to reallocate their capital in a good way, or for those that bring the actual solutions or services that are going to help us out from the dilemma. I'd like to expand a little bit on the challenge that Daniel was referring to. So population growth is of course taking place primarily in the growth or emerging markets, and it's quite understandable and justified that a higher living standard that is based on consuming is in high demand. Now the problem lies in this, that if that living standard is taking the same path, carbon-intensive path, as it has done historically in the old economies, the developed economies, then we are going to fail. So, and that's where the imbalance between where the money has lied and where it needs to be invested is. And that's something that we need certainly international policy for, in addition to regulation that encourages and partly forces to reallocate capital in infrastructure that are helping us to solve the problem. But I'm also an optimist. The challenges are huge. I think that we need to believe in that we can do this and take the action that it requires. I think it was Henry Ford who said that something like there are those who believe they can reach the targets and there are those who don't. They probably both are going to be right. Let's take the right.
Thank you, Thomas. So thank you very much for having shared with us this very comprehensive view and complementary view. I think it's very helpful. I'd like to bring a second question on the table to the panelists, more related to the trend into regulation for the capital market and also the bank regulation. We have seen more and more regulatory bodies. Of course, that is the case in China, in green SRI finance, the case in Southeast Asia, the case more recent within the European Commission. How do you see that as obstacles, as opportunities? And finally, how can we hope that all the investments, all the financing that we put on the table are in a sustainable way? How do you see that? Daniel, you start?
So I think there's a growing recognition that at present the financial system misprices climate risk. And I think that's an important starting point, because if you believe in this, then you suddenly have a regulatory mandate. And I think the Bank of England in particular, and Michael I'm sure will talk more about this, has done a lot of work over the last actually year and a half to evidence that we actually are mispricing risk. Because otherwise a regulator doesn't really have a mandate. They're a prudential regulator, and a prudential regulator should look after the safety and soundness of the financial system. If you believe that by always looking at the past and not looking at the future, the system misprices that risk, suddenly you get a mandate. And I think that's really, really important. And regulation sometimes sounds really, really scary, but if you look at what, in this case, the Bank of England is doing, they're looking at 4 dimensions. The first dimension is, are companies embedding climate risk into the way they run and do governance? So do boards have oversight? Do senior managers actually have accountability? That sounds all quite sensible. The second is, do companies integrate climate risk into the way to do risk management? They look at credit risk. That sounds quite sensible, because if I lend money to someone for 10 years, I want to be sure that that company is around in 10 years from now. The third element is disclosure. So the Bank of England is asking companies to actually disclose climate risk. Again, that sounds very sensible. If you believe in the well-functioning of financial markets, good information actually is a good driving force. And the fourth element is scenario planning. And again, if you believe that nobody knows how the world will actually look like in 20 years from now, but different scenarios will probably get you the right answer, that also makes sense. So I think sometimes the banks and the financial service industry is afraid of regulation, but if you go through these different elements, that all sounds very, very sensible, and I think it creates a common language, a common playing field where the industry can evolve. So I think the work done by the leading regulators, especially as part of this network of the NGFS, is something that will be the biggest driver for change in the system. But I also would like to echo the point we made before. This is also a huge opportunity. We know this is the biggest driver for global investments for the next few decades. So it's not just about managing risk, it's also about creating the right products that mobilize the money. And again, this is a field where regulation will need to help, where central banks and governments will need to manage some of the risks that exist with political risk, foreign exchange. Multilateral development banks are very important to provide blended finance. So I think, again, we need both sides of the coin here, but what is currently, I think, happening in the regulatory space will have a very fundamental impact on the way the system works.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, 2 quick things to add. Firstly, I think that regulators are have the potential to, and I think the early signs are they are having quite a lot of impact around definitions, data, etc. And I think that for sustainable finance to be done in a way that is credible, so there'll be lots of things that want to badge themselves as sustainable. I think for that to be validated and for that to be robust in the industry, having good data, good definitions and strong analytics around these things are important, and I think regulation can play a big role. I also think the other thing that certainly I find very hopeful about regulators like the Bank of England getting involved here is I think that in a number of parts of the world we have politicians not necessarily thinking and acting in the right way in terms of taking a long-term mindset, and I think a number of regulators are stepping into that breach. And I think when we talk about multiple stakeholders needing to come together, government is obviously a critical one, and whether it's that governments either don't have a belief in the science around this, whether it's that they're thinking on a 2 to 3 year election timetable and they don't think that this is going to swing votes in that time frame, we need to have other policymakers who are taking a more appropriate long-term mindset, and I think a number of regulators around the world have stepped up to that. Given these issues are global, anywhere that I think regulators can coordinate in a global fashion would be helpful. because obviously we need global solutions to global challenges, and we don't want this to overly fragment amongst different regulators. So efforts that bring the regulators together with a common voice, I think, is also very, very helpful to investors, and ultimately, I think, to the long-term outcomes we're trying to achieve, not just economically, but from a climate point of view.
Thank you, Jackie, for this question.
I guess the subject is the
Bank of England guy.
Yeah, the Bank of England guy, exactly. By the way, Daniel did an excellent job of outlining the 4 key elements that we're concerned in from the Bank of England. We just finished this year a supervision note on how we're going to look at the financial industry, both insurance and banking, from a regulatory point of view around climate change. It actually is a very, normally I wouldn't say, but it really is a good piece of reading. And also it's important to know that in 2021, I believe will be the first central bank ever to do stress testing on climate change in the financial industry. And like Singapore, obviously the United Kingdom and London is a financial capital of the world. So doing that type of stress testing will, I think, have a profound effect on the markets. But what's interesting is when we put together the NGFS, and it did come out of a discussion between our colleagues at the Banque de France and the Bank of England, and it blossomed so quickly to have almost 50 central banks. And at the very first meeting in Amsterdam, the first speaker was actually a scientist from Cambridge University. The risk that we see to the financial system is rooted in what could happen both from a transitional risk and fiscal risks due to real science and what is happening in the world. And I think that's really important to note. It's not something that the regulators are doing on speculation. It's grounded in science. And the work that the NGFS is doing is quite profound. I think being able to have that many central banks having a discussion around how these risks may manifest. We've seen in the last couple of days issues in Bangladesh flooding, in Australia wildfires, United States wildfires, and Delhi pollution. These are absolutely profound risks, not only most certainly to the individuals, but to their real economies and the financial systems that finance those real economies. So I think there is a real role for the regulators, both domestically as well on an international basis, to continue to gather data, make empirically based decisions, and they are starting to come along. People didn't historically keep data on this information. And even as Daniel pointed out, when people make decisions, when bankers and fund managers make decisions, they would look at a company and they would look at traditionally, can they pay their debt? Do they have barriers to entry? Do they have a reasonable management and some good margins? And all those are absolutely critical parts for any successful company. And now they also have to look, and this goes to scenario planning, what's their carbon footprint? Because there is going to be, and there already is regulation, so that's going to be a cost on their free cash flow, on their capital. So if you're thinking about investing in that, you need to understand the regulatory effects on that portion of their free cash flow. And that's a real decision if you're in the financial community trying to place your funds. And I would argue, and Singapore being a world leader in managing their water will probably be something that you want to look at as well. So ultimately, there's a variety of items that are really being picked up that I think are absolutely critical to investment decisions that are based in risk that the financial regulators and central banks are looking at.
Thank you, Michael. Thomas, anything to add? They have been very good so far, so it's a challenge for you now.
Very good comments here by my colleague. But I think we need a full toolbox actually. So regulation is one, actually self-regulating is one, and I think that initiatives like the Principles of Responsible Investment, now Principles for Responsible Banking, have been quite successful. The latter one being fairly young still, of course. But regulation is the big thing right now in sustainable finance, and with a good reason. So the common definitions, as mentioned, are missing. How ESG risks are to be taken into account in any financial decisions. What is a benchmark, what is a low carbon benchmark, and how do you take into account the end beneficiaries' ESG expectations and meet that with matching products. So there are many things that need to have common ground or a common understanding, and regulation or norms are ways to build that understanding. And the reason that we need all this is, of course, that if we continue business as usual, we are on a path to a fairly unpleasant future. So the market hasn't so far been able to fix this. Let's be clear on that. There are many reasons for that. Probably both intergenerational, intergeographical reasons. So, for example, we have a mispricing, of course, of externalities. And the thing with climate change is that what we do now will have huge implications many years from now. So whatever you discount from 30 years from now, it will become very small with any reasonable discounting numbers. It will disappear, the problem. And that's one reason for the mispricing. Another one is probably that a large share of the unpleasant outcome will happen somewhere else where the capital lies. The capital is under evaluation. So the problem with developed economies and developing economies. So that's another reason for why the risk is unpriced, and probably because of too little understanding of what actually is may happen in different scenarios. So those are things that have led to the situation. So yes, we need regulation, and also noting that many jurisdictions is working with its EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. Has come fairly far. A couple of directives already in place, and the taxonomy of building. But that's not the only place or region where regulation is being built up. The capital markets are global, so we would fairly need something that is reasonably harmonized across economies in order for that to work well. And for that purpose, I guess that also the International Platform for Sustainable Finance is set up. With the EU as a driver, but we've got China, India, we've got several other countries, major economies, Canada and so forth, signing up. And I think that's actually very timely. That's what we start to need now when we have national and regional initiatives with the aim of mobilizing the financial sector in different areas to take into account these things. And finally, on the how much we are going to see responsibly invested or money given in lending, 2,100, I think 100%. If we are today somewhere at, well, there are different numbers on it, but at least 30%, and 100,000 million USD is with PRI signatories, so that's in a good way. I think 2,100, 100% is going to be invested. Maybe criminals' money is an exception, but otherwise, yes.
Thank you, Thomas. I love the 100%. Thanks. I think you have shared with us very great views on the involvement of the regulators and the positive trends that regulators are giving in the capital and bank markets. That's what that is. Has been very helpful. So it's not an obstacle, but it's really pushing the money to the right direction, to more sustainable investments. So I think we can have a very positive view. The next topic and last one that we'll have to debate today is more on I would say, on the long-term future. In particular, how do you see, how can the world harvest the crisis? And do you think that there is a planet B option, i.e. a completely new way of consumption? So of course, we are talking about financial markets, but it goes beyond the capital markets. So should we consider having a remodeling of all financial systems and also corporate culture? We are all working in a very large corporate institutions, so should we completely reshift that model? And do you think that we can achieve that, this very big change? Could you share with us some views and maybe more feelings, because it's maybe difficult to be very pragmatic at this stage, but could you share with us some views on the Planet B option, please? If you're ready.
So, first of all, there is no Planet B. Right? I think one of the problems that we at the moment have in many of the climate models is that there is that magic at the end in 2050 where suddenly you get these incredible negative emissions, and we all know this is not something we can rely on. So I think there is no Planet B. And if you look at it, this is the time right now where we are completely rewiring the economy and the financial system. And I think this is the time when we pick the next winners and losers of the global economy. You see some countries pushing ahead, trying to use this to leapfrog. Especially when you're here in Asia, in China, here in Singapore, you see people realizing that we are now defining industries that will dominate the next 100 years, not the last 100 years. And if you have that mindset, you actually see this as a huge opportunity. And I think we are here at the Singapore Fintech Festival, right? There is a real role for innovation. Not just Fintech innovation, real innovation in the way we change consumer behavior and the way we change consumption patterns, production patterns. Because if you look at the facts, we know that the companies that are operating today will most likely have to be the companies that invest trillions into this transition. If they don't, they will be replaced by companies that probably have been founded just a year ago. We've seen that in China. Right? A lot of the companies that are currently the most valuable companies in the world didn't exist 5 years ago. The same thing will happen here. So I think for the financial system, it's incredibly important that we start to understand how do you support these companies? How do we pick the winners? But also, how do we filter out the companies that are not doing the right thing? And we talked a lot about data today. It's really hard. It is very hard to understand what company is brown or green, and in reality, all of them are somewhere along that journey. And I think that's the job for the next few years, to get enough transparency into this space. We pick the winners and get out of the people that will not be around in 10 years from now. And maybe just the last comment, many of you know that next year is named the super year on climate. The COP26, the 5-year checkpoint after the Paris Agreement, is going to be a very, very important year to actually set the right standards to either accelerate the transition or probably accept that we will not manage to achieve it. And so I think the next 12 months will be absolutely critical to mobilize the right forces between governments, private sector, consumers to achieve this.
Thank you, Daniel.
Look, as I said earlier, I'm very optimistic about humanity's capability to make this transition. I don't think Planet B is a good plan, so I don't think we can depend on that. But I do think we have we have enormous capability. We do also have real obstacles, and I think one of the things is that, as I spoke about earlier, I think we're going to need to have multiple stakeholders adopt a more long-term point of view. I think we're going to have to think about how do we support various groups through this transition. I mean, just as one example, in the US, there's obviously been a lot of discussion about, coal, and President Trump's spoken very vocally about wanting to support the coal industry. The reality is the renewable industry in the US now employs more people than the coal industry. But the notion that there is an entire industry that's going to be wiped out, we need to think, how do we support those individuals, just from a social point of view, as employment, etc. We have to ultimately come together, and I think that's very challenging in this political and global environment. But I do think we need to act with urgency. I do think that efforts around data, I think efforts around helping very significant pools of capital, that certainly in the conversations I have around the region and around the world want to support this transition. I think it is there, but I think the world has a lot of work to do. And we've all touched on this to some extent. The need for a thoughtful, long-term, harmonised approach is incredibly important. And there are a lot of obstacles to that, given our current geopolitical dynamic, given short-termism, etc. So the obstacles are real, but I think the urgency is there and the willingness is there if we can find a way to act together.
Thank you, guys. Michael?
I'm going to have to agree with them. I think ultimately the future really is for 2100. You can see it right here, right now. Some of the solutions are on the other side of that curtain. But if you look at the different types of companies that are coming out and the new technologies that are developing, when I chaired the G20, we spent a lot of our time looking at how technology would drive sustainability. And even just in the last month, there's been reports from the International Energy Agency that renewable wind farms could actually power the entire world by 2040. That everywhere you go in the world right now, wind and solar are cheaper per gigawatt than any other type of fossil fuel. But then you move to agriculture, looking at some of the incredible innovation innovations around their vertical farms, where you can ring them around cities. For some plants, you can get 26 crops a year, 90% less water, healthier, bring them into the urban centers on electric vehicles. Also in agriculture, you look at the most successful IPO so far in the last 5 years was Beyond Meat, basically a plant-based protein company with their rival Impossible Burger probably on the way. Harvard University just printed some information around lab-based proteins, and some of the biggest food companies in the world are actually buying these up. It's technology driving it. And part of the reason is 75% of the soybeans globally are used to feed livestock. So if we started moving in these directions, but we are, that's my point. It is happening right here, right now. Mobility, both hydrogen and electric are coming online. The OECD did a brilliant study in the city of Lisbon. They took a look at the traffic patterns. In this simulation, they took out 100% of individually owned cars and brought back the percentage of cars needed where everyone could get a drive, the same drive they had. The amount brought back was 3%. Imagine 97% of automobiles leaving urban centers. The future is right now, and it's being able to get the financial industries, the policymakers to help support the real economy, and most importantly, getting the populations, getting those stakeholders rallied around it. So the solutions are here. The solutions for 21 are here right now. We don't need to wait for that technology. So with that, I think we have to be optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you for the push.
Just reflecting on the planet B now, the younger generations, consumers, say below 30, are clearly much more aware of what they choose as consumers, and pay attention to ESG factors or also climate matters. I think that the fact that we see great concern, even what we call climate anxiety among millennials, for instance. I mean, we see that the Greta Thunberg movement and so forth. That's a sign of that it's about living conditions on the planet where these people are likely to spend the rest of their lives. So I think we need to stick to the planet we have. Now, good news as well. KPMG annually makes a CEO outlook where we interview 1,500 CEOs of the biggest companies. Or I don't know if it's good news, it's probably a bit sweet and sour. Because in the latest one from this year, the topic that is the biggest threat to growth of business is actually climate change and environmental matters. Last year it was on place 4. So the awareness is great. That is raised as a threat is of course not so great. But then at least I think it also shows a shift in awareness and even corporate culture. So the debate on purpose of business beyond pure financial return, I think that's a very healthy one, and it links to this matter. Also, talking to our clients, there are many clients who see the business opportunities are quite ambitious. So, for instance, currently we are supporting a Chinese asset manager who wants to be world-class on responsible investment. And there are many others who really see the opportunities and are working for it in a very systematic way. And overall, I think that's what financial institutions should do. Take a long-term view, probably with a strategy period targets and a longer-term vision. Work holistically on climate. What does it mean for your different businesses? What targets should you set? Where are you now, honestly? And what are the steps it takes to those targets? So a lot of work to do, but I think that's the way to go. Now, a final point that I would like to see is also putting really numbers to the story, as I call it. The story is very solid. We all know that we need to act. But also demonstrate that it's good business in numerically, and that's happening. So we already have statistics on how ESG score investment objects are actually giving a better return than those with a lower score. And of course, we need to review those critically, but the burden of evidence, so to say, it's also building up. So show that what you do is good business.
Thank you, Thomas. So thank you for this view. I would like to summarize a bit with, I think, keywords and expressions that you have used, just to highlight. I think it's important to keep some key messages, and I will pick up a few names and expressions from issue. So I will say, I will share again. It has been said, but just for you to keep something when you will be leading to the fintech world and with more technology. So transition. I think transition has been is a key topic. Transparency, was shared with by Daniel. Super year for COP26, and super year means next year. Urgency there. Solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuel. That's very important. Happening right now, so you see the agency matter coming back. Solutions are here, so positive views. I think we all share positive views. Awareness, so I think it's a question of as well everybody being aware. Thank you very much for this, for having shared all these views and facts and giving positive facts. Now I will pick up, maybe we have time for 2 questions. Since we have talked about the US, can we show this one on the up? True, yes, now. We have talked a bit about the US, and you have seen the recent news regarding the US and the result from the COP25 event. So the question is, can the world win on climate change without the US? Assuming Donald Trump will be elected next year, so we need to work on a 6-year scenario. Which country can step up to drive the agenda forward? Anybody?
I think the Trump administration's view on climate change is disappointing, and obviously it would be better and stronger if they were at the table in a big way. Having said that, I think that when you look at the US, firstly you see many, many states led by California who are still very, very keen to engage, and it's worth noting that California, I'm not sure of exactly where it would rank, but I think it's the 12th largest economy in the world as a state, so I still think that we have meaningful portions of American government who are engaged. I also think if you look at the US corporate sector, they are also responding, many companies, and looking to take action themselves. So I think that we need to push forward regardless, and I think that again, we need to take a long-term view, and hopefully over time the policy position of the US will adjust.
I wish there was a silver bullet for everything, and I don't think one country, I think a variety of them have to take the lead. So I'll put my G20 hat back on again and see the collectiveness of key countries. You see them in Europe. There's several that are actual world leaders, but if you go the work that Australia's done, their latest commission out of Canada, Singapore, without a doubt, is a world leader. But I think being able to pull together and have very firm goals, and as we've seen them, if we don't have them, we're lost. But the coordination, I think, is more important than any one single country. I'd like to also echo the point on the U.S. I think California would be the 8th largest economy in the world. So ultimately, California is doing well. So for whoever asked the question, yes, it would be fantastic if the U.S. federal government was coming along for the ride, but the country as a whole is doing amazing things. We're heading towards our targets, the cities, the states, and I think we should not despair over that.
Certainly not allow it as an excuse.
No, exactly.
They're realistic. We will either win or lose the fight against climate change in this region.
Yeah.
And we have more than a billion people in China, more than a billion people in India, and far more than a billion people in the rest of Asia, growing at a speed, population-wise, consumption-wise, and as a broader footprint on the world, that will either determine whether we achieve this or not. And therefore, I think the investments that we're making now are so important. We're building the cities of the future right now. We're building the infrastructure of the future right now. We can either build this in the right way or the wrong way. At the moment, I think we have a few pockets in Asia that are leading this, but many places that are at the moment catching up with the rest of the world, and catching up with the rest of the world on the same economic terms sadly will not work. We need to find new formulas, and I think that's really urgent.
If I could jump in real quickly on this, my co-chair, Marjan, was saying that China's working incredibly hard, but even if China were to go net neutral and the rest of this part of the world doesn't, the rest of this part of the world will commit 3 times the amount of carbon that China does today. So it's important that collectively the actions in Southeast Asia, everyone does need to be part of that solution. Otherwise, we fail.
And it doesn't mean that the rest of the world shouldn't do the right thing, but we know we need to
Yes.
create the right frameworks here.
Absolutely.
And also pointing out that both investors and business in US are doing a lot of things. Actually, also on the public side, cities and states, in addition to California. So, but of course, it would be great to have everybody on board. I agree that that's not. We have a critical mass, and there are things that need to be done elsewhere in the US as well.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed, there are a lot of things happening. Thank you. Let's go to the next question, which is more relating to harmonization across the world. So how big a hurdle are the stable finance investment guidelines for the development of these green and SRI markets? So when do you see them harmonization across the world? That's true that there have been a lot of markets having set up their own regulation. What's your view on that? So let's try to be short, because there is another question that I'd like to share, because it's a challenging one, and I don't want to eliminate this question because of a lack of time. Please, let's be short and to
Now, given that we have very progressive regulation in EU already coming up, and we are looking at globally investing pension funds and other big institutional investors, I think that to some extent sort of the best-in-class action is going to spread, because imagine a big European pension fund who invests globally. I have a hard time believing that you would invest differently within EU than globally in other parts. So the same practices will sort of spread. If you're going to disclose how you take into account ESG risks in your investment decisions, you're going to do that for the whole portfolio. And secondly, we do see, well, Singapore, Hong Kong, the exchanges are quite busy supporting the financial sector in developing good practices. So that we support. And then we got the initiatives like the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, which are working on this. So I'm positive from that perspective that we are going to. There are several drivers that work towards a harmonized approach. It will take time, of course, but we are on the way.
Thank you, Thomas. Anything to add? Well, let's go to the challenging question. Yeah, okay, the panel is ready. So let's go. There seems to be a lot of optimism for all of us here today. However, there seems to be a huge gap between what needs to be done and what is being done. That's true. That's why we are talking about transition. So besides talking about it, and I know that we need to walk the talk as well. So how can we move the needle in a faster way? So I would say that it's a bit your wish list. That has to be realistic, of course. Yes. Daniel, you ready?
Happy to go. I have 3. First, we need a common language. We talked about this just now. Harmonization in terms of data and taxonomies. Second, I think we need to create a market for new technologies, and that needs a bit of carrot and a bit of stick. The carrot, I think, is the right incentives. Like can include a carbon price, because some new technologies will actually become viable once you have a carbon price. The stick is actually banning certain technologies and phasing them out with a long-term perspective in mind. And the third is creating financial instruments that mobilize money from where it sits at the moment, which is very often Western pension funds, into the projects that are needed in emerging markets.
Yeah, my thing would be, I'd echo a number. Firstly, I really am very focused on this data and definitions point. We need to give people information, we need to be able to do the analytics in order to actually make the assessments in a repeatable and meaningful way. I think that, look, long term, it's essential that humanity get this right, and ultimately by doing so we'll all be winners. I do think we need to think about winners and losers in the short term and how we actually collectively try to smooth some of that out. And then just to pick up on Daniel's final point, we have a lot of particularly pension long-term money in the West looking for somewhere to invest, and we need to think about the mechanisms and the mediums through which firms like BlackRock and others can help facilitate the transfer, because the money's there, the investments are there, and we need to make a stronger connection between the two.
Thank you. Jack.
I go right to the real economy and how the financial markets can help them. I mean, the obvious thing is energy transition. It has to happen. It has to happen in a variety of countries. So how do you bring together key international as well as national stakeholders? Is there a way of bringing them together and almost make it, I think Daniel referred to it, and I've used it as well, the equivalent of trying to put someone on the moon. It's such an imperative. It's such a global imperative that if we can bring together and facilitate that in and of itself is a huge step forward. As around the real economy can build the wind farms and the solar farms, the policymakers help drive it, the financial community, and drive some type of support at the population base. That would be my first and foremost.
Thank you, Mike. Thomas?
I think do the business analysis. That's what all financial sector actors should also incorporate. And I think you'll find out that you need to manage the risks and the opportunities both in the next strategy period and beyond. I think that's what's needed. The evidence is there, and overall I think we need to start living as if we intended to stay on this planet.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. It has been a pleasure to moderate this panel, and thank you for your views. Thanks to the audience for attending the conference, the panel, and also for your great questions. Thank you.